There are stories that don't end when the empires fall. Stories that echo in the languages we speak, the borders we cross, the systems we inherit without question. Imperialism didn't just reshape maps, it rewrote the soul of civilization itself. It carved trade routes through ancient forests, planted flags on sacred ground, and built cities over the ruins of worlds that came before. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and the weight of the day slips away, let's travel back through time together. Not to judge, not to argue, but to understand. To see how a handful of empires changed everything, how they built the world we wake up to, and left scars we're still learning to heal. Close your eyes if you need to. Let your mind drift. This is a story of power, of ambition, of human nature at its most restless. And like all great stories, it begins long before anyone knew how it would end. Before we begin this journey together, let me say something softly. If these words carry you closer to sleep, if they help the noise of the day fade into something quieter, then stay. Let this channel become a companion to your nights. A gentle voice when the world feels too loud. And if you find comfort here, consider sharing that warmth, subscribe, so these stories can find others who need them too. No pressure. Just an invitation. Now, let's walk together into the past. Long before the word empire existed, the instinct was already there. Buried deep in the human heart, older than language, older than law. It whispered in the minds of chieftains and kings, in farmers who eyed their neighbors' fields, in warriors who wondered what lay beyond the next hill. The urge to expand. To take. To claim what wasn't yours and make it so. This wasn't evil, not at first. It was survival. In a world where drought could wipe out a village, where winter could starve a tribe, strength meant safety. And safety often meant taking from someone weaker. The earliest empires rose from this simple truth. In Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, city-states fought for control of water, of fertile land, of trade routes that connected the known world. Around 2300 BCE, a king named Sargon of Akkad did something unprecedented. He didn't just conquer his neighbors, he kept going. City after city fell under his rule, until he controlled an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. He called himself King of the Universe, and perhaps in his mind, he was. The world, after all, was only as large as what you could see and hold. But empires aren't built on ambition alone. They need stories. Myths to justify the bloodshed, legends to make conquest feel like destiny. Sargon claimed the gods had chosen him, that his rule brought order to chaos. And perhaps it did, for some. Under one banner, trade flourished. Laws were written. Cities grew. But for every person who prospered, another was enslaved. For every culture that survived, another vanished into the dust of history, its language forgotten, its gods renamed or erased. This pattern would repeat across millennia. In Egypt, pharaohs built pyramids on the backs of laborers and claimed divine right. In China, dynasties rose and fell, each one expanding the borders a little further, absorbing tribes and kingdoms into something they called the Middle Kingdom, the center of all civilization. In Persia, Cyrus the Great conquered with unusual mercy, allowing defeated peoples to keep their customs, their religions. His empire stretched from India to Greece, and for a brief moment, it seemed that conquest could be gentle. But even kindness, when imposed by force, carries the weight of domination. And then came Alexander. A young Macedonian king who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. He crossed into Asia with an army of Greeks and never stopped moving. Egypt. Persia. India. Everywhere he went, he planted cities named after himself, Alexandria, 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 monuments to his own hunger for immortality. He married a Persian princess, adopted their customs, tried to blend cultures into something new. But when he died at 32, his empire shattered. His generals carved it into pieces, fought over the scraps, and within a generation, it was as if the dream had never existed. Except it had. The world had changed. Greek culture spread across Asia. Ideas mixed. Languages blended. Trade routes connected civilizations that had never known each other existed. Imperialism, even when it failed, left marks that wouldn't fade. It planted seeds that would grow in unexpected soil, shaping futures no conqueror could have imagined. Rome learned from Alexander's mistake. They built slowly, methodically, absorbing one territory at a time. They didn't just conquer, they integrated. Defeated enemies became Roman citizens. Local gods were welcomed into the Roman pantheon. Roads stretched across continents, connecting Britain to Jerusalem, Spain to Egypt. The Pax Romana, they called it. Roman peace. And for 2 centuries, it held. Trade flourished. Cities bloomed. Roman law, Roman language, Roman architecture spread across half the known world. But peace, in empire, is always fragile. It rests on the constant threat of violence, the legions stationed at every border, the brutal suppression of rebellion. When Spartacus led a slave revolt, Rome crucified 6,000 men along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot as a warning. When Jerusalem rebelled, Rome raised the Second Temple and scattered the Jewish people across the empire. Peace, yes. But at what cost? The Roman Empire didn't just conquer land, it conquered time itself. Long after the last emperor fell, Roman ideas lived on. Their laws became the foundation of legal systems across Europe. Their language evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian. Their roads, built 2,000 years ago, still lie beneath modern highways. Even their architecture, those grand columns, those soaring arches, became the template for government buildings, banks, monuments of power everywhere. Rome fell, but it never truly died. It seeped into the bones of civilization itself. But why? What drove Rome, and all the empires before it, to expand so relentlessly? Was it simply greed? The hunger for gold, for slaves, for tribute? Partly. But there was something deeper. Something almost spiritual. Empires saw themselves as bringers of order, civilization, enlightenment. They looked at the world beyond their borders and saw chaos, barbarians who needed saving, lands that needed taming, peoples who needed guidance. This belief, this conviction of superiority, made conquest feel not just justified, but necessary. Even noble. The Romans called it their duty. The Greeks called it spreading Hellenistic culture. The Chinese dynasties spoke of bringing harmony to all under heaven. Every empire wrapped its ambitions in virtue, dressed its violence in the language of destiny. And perhaps some truly believed it. Perhaps when Roman engineers built aqueducts to bring fresh water to distant provinces, they felt pride, not shame. Perhaps when Chinese scholars taught Confucian philosophy to conquered peoples, they saw themselves as teachers, not oppressors. But belief doesn't erase harm. The Celts in Britain didn't ask for Roman roads. The Gauls didn't beg for Latin. The countless tribes absorbed into the Persian Empire didn't dream of becoming Persian. They had their own dreams, their own stories, their own ways of seeing the world. And imperialism, no matter how benevolent it claimed to be, required those dreams to bend or break. Still, something strange happened over time. Cultures mixed. Bloodlines blurred. The conquered sometimes became the conquerors. Rome itself was eventually ruled by emperors from Spain, from North Africa, from Syria. The legions that defended the empire were filled with soldiers from every corner of its territory, Germans, Greeks, Africans, all wearing Roman armor, all calling themselves Roman. Identity became fluid, complex. The empire didn't just change the world, it changed itself. And when Rome finally fell, when the barbarians poured through the gates and the Western Empire collapsed into warlords and ruin, something unexpected happened. The conquerors didn't destroy Roman culture, they tried to preserve it. The Germanic tribes who carved up Europe wanted to be seen as Rome's heirs, not its destroyers. They kept using Latin in their courts. They crowned their kings in Roman ceremonies. They built their cathedrals in Roman style. The empire lived on, like a ghost haunting the halls of history, shaping the world long after its body had crumbled to dust. In the east, the Byzantine Empire carried the torch for another 1,000 years. Constantinople became the jewel of the Mediterranean, a city of marble and gold where Roman law met Greek philosophy and Christian faith. They called themselves Romans, even as they spoke Greek, even as their culture evolved into something entirely new. And when Constantinople finally fell in 1453, when Ottoman cannons breached the ancient walls, even the conquerors were awed by what they found. Mehmed II, the Ottoman Sultan, declared himself the new Caesar, the inheritor of Rome's legacy. The empire had died again, but its ghost refused to rest. Across the world, other empires rose and fell in similar patterns. In Central America, the Maya built cities of stone in the jungle, studying the stars, creating calendars of breathtaking complexity. Then they vanished, their cities swallowed by vines, their writing system lost for centuries. The Aztecs came after, building their own empire on the ruins, demanding tribute from conquered peoples, sacrificing prisoners to keep the sun rising. When the Spanish arrived, they would use these grievances, turning conquered tribes against their Aztec rulers, proving that empires create enemies even among those they dominate. In Africa, the Kingdom of Aksum controlled trade routes between Rome and India, minting coins with crosses before most of Europe was Christian. Ghana rose as an empire of gold, so wealthy that its kings tied their horses to nuggets of pure metal. Mali followed, and its emperor Mansa Musa made a pilgrimage to Mecca so laden with gold that he crashed the economy of Egypt simply by passing through. These were empires of sophistication, of learning, of power, but history would forget them, or pretend they never mattered, because the later European empires wrote the textbooks. In Asia, empires followed their own rhythms, their own philosophies of power. The Mongols, emerging from the steppes in the 13th century, rewrote the rules entirely. They built the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the edges of Egypt. But they didn't do it with grand speeches about civilization or divine right. They did it with ruthless efficiency and terrifying speed. Genghis Khan's horsemen moved like wind across the grasslands, overwhelming armies 10 times their size, toppling dynasties that had stood for centuries. Cities that resisted were razed so completely that grass grew where streets had been. Cities that surrendered were spared, absorbed into a vast network of trade and communication that connected East and West like never before. The Mongols didn't care about culture or religion. They were pragmatic conquerors. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, shamans, all were welcome in their courts as long as they served the empire. They borrowed Chinese technology, Persian administration, European tactics. They created a postal system so efficient that messages could travel 5,000 miles in weeks. They protected merchants, standardized weights and measures, guaranteed safe passage along the Silk Road. Under Mongol rule, a merchant could travel from Venice to Beijing with a single passport, carrying goods that would make fortunes in distant lands. But this peace, like Rome's, was built on bones. The Mongols killed an estimated 40 million people during their conquests, nearly 10% of the world's population at the time. Entire cities were depopulated. Irrigation systems destroyed. Forests burned. The death toll was so immense that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere actually dropped, because farmland returned to forest, because there weren't enough people left to work the fields. The Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, came at a cost that staggers the imagination. And yet, when the empire fragmented after Genghis Khan's death, when his grandsons carved it into competing khanates, the legacy remained. The connections they'd forged didn't disappear. Ideas continued to flow. The Black Death, ironically, traveled along those same trade routes, but so did gunpowder, papermaking, printing, mathematics. The Mongols, perhaps more than any other empire, proved that conquest could reshape the world in ways the conquerors never intended. In India, empires rose with different philosophies. The Mauryan Empire, under Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, began with conquest and bloodshed. Ashoka's armies swept across the subcontinent, bringing kingdoms to heel, expanding borders until most of India bowed to one throne. But after the Battle of Kalinga, where over 100,000 died, something in Ashoka broke. The chronicles say he walked through the killing fields, saw the rivers red with blood, heard the wails of widows and orphans, and wept. He converted to Buddhism, renounced violence, and spent the rest of his reign trying to rule with compassion. He erected pillars across his empire inscribed with edicts about kindness, tolerance, respect for all religions. He built hospitals, planted trees along roads, sent missionaries to spread Buddhist teachings rather than soldiers to spread his power. It was a beautiful dream. An empire trying to be gentle, to lift up rather than crush down. But dreams are fragile things. After Ashoka died, the empire splintered. His sons fought over the throne. The pillars he erected remained, weathered by centuries, but the empire of compassion faded into memory. Still, he proved something important, that the choice existed. That empires didn't have to be engines of destruction. They chose to be. Later, the Mughal Empire would try its own version of tolerance. Akbar the Great, ruling in the 16th century, married Hindu princesses, abolished the tax on non-Muslims, held debates between scholars of different faiths in his court. He tried to create a synthesis, a new religion that borrowed from Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, something that could unite his diverse empire under a shared spiritual vision. It didn't work. People clung to their own faiths, suspicious of anything that asked them to abandon what their ancestors had believed. But Akbar tried. He looked at his empire and saw not subjects to be controlled, but people to be understood. Yet even Akbar's tolerance had limits. The empire still demanded tribute. Still crushed rebellions. Still executed those who threatened its stability. Compassion in an empire is always bounded by power. The moment that power is challenged, compassion tends to retreat. By the time the sun set on these ancient empires, Rome, Mongolia, Maurya, Aksum, Mali, a pattern had become clear. Empires could bring prosperity, but it was never evenly distributed. They could spread ideas, but always at the cost of others. They could build magnificent things, but the laborers who built them rarely saw the benefits. And most importantly, no empire lasted forever. They all crumbled, given enough time. Sometimes quickly, in a storm of invasion and fire. Sometimes slowly, hollowed out from within by corruption, complacency, the sheer weight of trying to hold too much together. But the idea of empire, that seductive dream of bringing the whole world under one vision, one order, one rule, that idea never died. It simply waited, evolving, adapting, preparing for a new age. An age when ships would grow larger, weapons more deadly, and the hunger for expansion would no longer be limited by mountains or deserts or oceans. The seeds planted by Sargon, Alexander, Caesar, and Genghis Khan were about to bloom into something the ancient world could never have imagined. The age of global empire was coming. And it would change everything. The world was larger than anyone knew. Somewhere beyond the horizon, past the edge of every map, lands waited in silence. Civilizations rose and fell without Europe ever knowing they existed. The Americas thrived with empires of their own, the Inca in the mountains, the Aztec in the valleys, countless tribes and nations living lives as rich and complex as any in the Old World. Africa's kingdoms traded gold and knowledge across the Sahara. Asia's empires commanded populations that dwarfed Europe's scattered kingdoms. But Europe, fractured and hungry, didn't know any of this yet. They only knew what lay within sailing distance. And they wanted more. The 15th century brought a shift in the wind. For 1,000 years after Rome's fall, Europe had been turned inward, consumed by feudal wars, plagued by disease, humbled by the Crusades' failures. But something was stirring. New technologies emerged, better ships, more accurate maps, instruments that could navigate by the stars. The compass, borrowed from China. The astrolabe, refined by Islamic scholars. Europe didn't invent these tools, but they perfected them for a singular purpose, to sail farther than anyone had sailed before. Portugal moved first. A small nation on the edge of Europe, pressed against the Atlantic, with nowhere to expand but outward. Prince Henry the Navigator, though he never sailed himself, funded expedition after expedition down the coast of Africa. Each voyage pushed a little farther south, mapping coastlines, establishing trading posts, searching for a route around Africa to reach the spices of India without going through Muslim-controlled lands. The voyages were slow, cautious. Sailors feared what lay beyond the known world, sea monsters, boiling waters, the edge where the ocean simply ended and ships fell into nothing. But the ships kept returning. And each time, they brought back stories of kingdoms in Africa more sophisticated than European courts expected. Of gold and ivory, of peoples who traded eagerly but resisted conquest fiercely. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that Africa had an end, that the Indian Ocean lay beyond. 9 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey, reaching India and returning with a cargo of spices worth 60 times the cost of the expedition. The route was open. The profits were staggering. And Portugal, for a brief moment, controlled the doorway to the east. Spain watched with envy. Their rivals had found a path to wealth, and Spain wanted one too. When a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus proposed sailing west to reach Asia, most scholars laughed. They knew the earth was round, but they also knew it was far larger than Columbus believed. Sailing west would mean months at sea, starvation, death. But Spain's monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, had just completed the Reconquista, driving the last Muslims from Iberia. They were flush with victory, hungry for more glory, and willing to gamble on a fool's dream. Columbus never reached Asia. He died believing he had, but the land he found was something else entirely. A continent that European maps didn't include. A new world, they would call it, as if it hadn't been old to the millions already living there. On October 12, 1492, Columbus stepped onto an island in the Bahamas, planted a Spanish flag, and claimed it for his king and queen. The indigenous Taino people watched, curious, friendly, offering gifts. They had no concept of what that flag meant. No understanding that their world was about to end. Columbus returned to Spain with gold, parrots, and 6 Taino people as trophies. He described lands of incredible wealth, of naive peoples who could be easily conquered, of opportunities beyond imagination. Spain sent him back with 17 ships and 1,200 men. This time, there was no pretense of exploration. This was colonization. The Spanish built forts, demanded tribute, enslaved the indigenous people to mine gold. Those who resisted were killed. Those who complied died anyway, from overwork, from starvation, from diseases their bodies had never encountered, smallpox, measles, influenza. Within 50 years, the Taino were virtually extinct. An entire people, gone. But Spain was just beginning. Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519 with 600 men, 16 horses, and a few small cannons. The Aztec Empire, ruling over millions, watched him approach. Their emperor, Moctezuma II, hesitated. Aztec prophecy spoke of a god returning from the east, and Cortés's arrival seemed to match the timing. Or perhaps Moctezuma simply miscalculated, assuming these strange foreigners could be managed, used, controlled. By the time he understood his mistake, it was too late. Cortés didn't conquer the Aztecs alone. He couldn't have. But he forged alliances with tribes who hated Aztec rule, who paid tribute in blood and gold, who saw the Spanish as liberators rather than new oppressors. Together, they laid siege to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, a city of canals and pyramids, larger and cleaner than most European cities. They cut off its water, its food. Smallpox swept through the population, killing thousands. When the city finally fell in 1521, the Spanish razed it. They built Mexico City on its ruins, using stones from Aztec temples to construct Catholic churches. One empire literally buried beneath another. Francisco Pizarro watched what Cortés had done and learned. A decade later, he sailed down the western coast of South America with even fewer men, barely 200, seeking his own empire to topple. He found the Inca, ruling a territory that stretched 4,000 kilometers along the Andes, a civilization of engineered terraces and mountain roads, of cities built at altitudes where European lungs struggled to breathe. The Inca had no writing, but they kept records with knotted strings called quipu. They had no wheel, but their road system rivaled Rome's. They had no iron, but their stonework was so precise that even today, you cannot slide a knife blade between the blocks. Pizarro arrived during a civil war. The previous emperor had died of smallpox, a disease that had traveled faster than the Spanish themselves, spreading from the Caribbean through trade networks, killing millions before the conquistadors even arrived. His sons fought over succession, and the empire was fracturing. Pizarro exploited this brilliantly. He invited the new emperor, Atahualpa, to a meeting, promised friendship, then sprang a trap. Spanish cavalry charged into the plaza. Cannons fired. Swords flashed. Within minutes, thousands of Inca were dead, and Atahualpa was a prisoner. The emperor offered a ransom, a room filled with gold, twice over with silver. Enough wealth to purchase a kingdom. Pizarro accepted, waited for the treasure to arrive, then executed Atahualpa anyway. Without their god-king, the Inca resistance fractured. Some regions fought on for decades, retreating into the mountains, launching raids, refusing to submit. But the Spanish held the cities, controlled the mines, and most importantly, they kept coming. More ships. More soldiers. More diseases. The Inca population, estimated at 10 million before contact, would collapse to fewer than 1 million within a century. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Across the Americas, indigenous populations fell by as much as 90%. Some historians call it the largest demographic catastrophe in human history. Entire civilizations vanished. Languages died with their last speakers. Knowledge, of medicine, astronomy, agriculture, was lost forever. The conquistadors melted down golden artifacts of stunning artistry to ship back as bullion. They burned books, destroyed temples, outlawed native religions. They saw the indigenous peoples not as humans with their own value, but as obstacles, or resources, or at best, souls to be saved through forced conversion. And Europe celebrated. Gold and silver flooded in, so much that it caused inflation, distorting economies for generations. Spain became the wealthiest nation in Europe, funding wars, building palaces, spreading its influence across the continent. But the wealth was built on extraction, on violence, on a system that would come to define colonialism for centuries: take everything of value, give nothing back, and call it progress. Portugal, meanwhile, carved out its own claim. When Columbus's discoveries became known, Pope Alexander VI drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic: everything west belonged to Spain, everything east to Portugal. It was called the Treaty of Tordesillas, an agreement between two Christian kingdoms to divide the entire non-Christian world between them. The audacity is breathtaking. Two nations, claiming the right to own continents, peoples, futures that had nothing to do with them. Portugal took Brazil, almost by accident. A fleet blown off course landed there in 1500 and claimed it immediately. But Portugal's real prize was Africa and Asia. They established trading posts along the African coast, buying gold, ivory, and increasingly, slaves. The Portuguese didn't invent slavery, it had existed in various forms in almost every civilization. But they industrialized it. They created a system of chattel slavery, where human beings were property, where children inherited their parents' enslaved status, where race became the defining marker of who could be owned. The transatlantic slave trade began as a trickle and became a flood. Millions of Africans, captured in wars or kidnapped from villages, were marched to the coast, packed into ships so tightly they could barely move, sailed across an ocean many had never seen, and sold in markets like livestock. Those who survived the Middle Passage, and 1 in 6 didn't, faced lives of brutal labor on plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, eventually North America. They grew sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee. Cash crops that Europeans craved, that generated enormous wealth, that required endless labor to harvest. The plantation system was empire in microcosm. A small number of Europeans controlling vast lands and even vaster numbers of enslaved people, extracting wealth that flowed back to the mother country. The enslaved received nothing, no wages, no freedom, no recognition of their humanity. Their labor built economies. Their suffering funded European wars, cathedrals, universities. And when they resisted, when they ran, when they fought back, they were hunted, tortured, killed as examples. But resistance never stopped. In Haiti, in Jamaica, in Brazil, enslaved people escaped and formed their own communities, maroon societies that survived for generations in mountains and jungles, free zones that stood as proof that the system could be challenged. Some mounted revolts. Some poisoned their masters. Some simply survived, preserving their languages, their religions, their humanity, waiting for the day when the chains would break. While Spain and Portugal divided the New World, other European powers watched and grew restless. England, France, the Netherlands, they saw the wealth flowing into Iberian coffers and wanted their share. But they arrived late to the game. The richest lands were already claimed, the easiest conquests already completed. So they adapted. They became pirates first, then colonizers. English privateers like Francis Drake raided Spanish treasure ships, stealing gold that Spain had stolen from the Americas. Queen Elizabeth I knighted Drake for his thievery, because when the victim is your rival, theft becomes patriotism. France explored the northern reaches of the Americas, where Spain hadn't bothered to go. They sailed up the St. Lawrence River, traded with indigenous nations for furs, established colonies that grew slowly, cautiously. The French approach was different. They needed indigenous allies to survive the harsh winters, to navigate the vast forests, to supply the beaver pelts that were fashionable in Europe. So they traded, intermarried, formed alliances. It wasn't equality, but it was pragmatic cooperation. At least until the land itself became valuable, and then the old patterns reasserted. The land was taken. The treaties were broken. The indigenous peoples were pushed aside. The Dutch came with merchant instincts. They didn't want to conquer souls or plant flags for glory, they wanted profit, pure and simple. The Dutch East India Company became the world's first megacorporation, a private company with its own army, its own navy, its own right to wage war and sign treaties. It colonized Indonesia, established a brutal monopoly on the spice trade, and massacred entire populations on islands that grew nutmeg, just to keep prices high. When the people of the Banda Islands resisted Dutch control, the company killed or enslaved nearly the entire population, 15,000 people, and replaced them with Dutch colonists and enslaved laborers. It was genocide for profit margins. England took a different path. They tried to establish colonies in North America, and failed repeatedly. The first settlements starved, succumbed to disease, were abandoned. But they kept trying, and eventually, they learned. Jamestown survived by growing tobacco, another cash crop, another plantation economy, another system that would soon demand enslaved labor. The Pilgrims arrived seeking religious freedom, and found it by displacing the Wampanoag people who had helped them survive their first winter. More ships followed. More settlers. The colonies grew. But these weren't the empires of old, where a single power radiated from a capital city. These were something new, colonies separated from the homeland by an ocean, yet still bound by law, by trade, by identity. The colonists were English, even when they'd never seen England. They enforced English law, spoke English, saw themselves as bringing English civilization to a wild land. Never mind that the land wasn't wild, that it was managed carefully by peoples who had lived there for thousands of years, who burned forests strategically to encourage game, who cultivated crops that would feed the world: corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, tobacco. The colonists saw wilderness because they didn't recognize the hand that shaped it. And so they took it. Treaty after treaty, signed and broken. Land purchased for trinkets or stolen outright. When indigenous nations resisted, the colonists waged war, armed with guns against bows, backed by diseases that spread like invisible armies. Some tribes formed alliances with the colonists, hoping to use European power against their own enemies. It rarely worked out well. The pattern was always the same: cooperation, then exploitation, then expulsion. The indigenous peoples were pushed west, always west, until there was nowhere left to go. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Africa was being carved up from the coasts. Europeans didn't penetrate the interior, not yet. Tropical diseases killed them as surely as smallpox killed indigenous Americans. Malaria, yellow fever, sleeping sickness, Africa had its own defenses. So the Europeans stayed on the coasts, building forts, establishing trading posts, buying slaves from African middlemen who captured them in the interior. It was a terrible collaboration. African kingdoms grew wealthy selling their enemies, their criminals, their own people. European kingdoms grew wealthier still, feeding the insatiable demand for labor in the Americas. The Indian Ocean trade was different. Here, Europeans encountered civilizations that matched or exceeded their own. The Mughal Empire in India was wealthier than any European kingdom. China's Ming dynasty dwarfed them in population and sophistication. Japan's samurai could match any European knight. These were not lands that could be conquered with a few hundred men and some horses. So Europeans traded, carefully, humbly at first. They requested permission to build trading posts. They paid taxes to local rulers. They adapted to local customs. But they were learning. Mapping coastlines. Noting defenses. Observing internal conflicts. Waiting for opportunities. The Portuguese established Goa in India, a small foothold that became a base for further expansion. The Dutch seized Malacca, controlling the strait between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. The English founded the East India Company, chartered by Queen Elizabeth I with the right to establish forts, maintain armies, and wage war in the name of trade. These companies, the English East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the French Compagnie des Indes, were empires within empires. They answered to shareholders, not kings. Their goal was profit, not glory. But they wielded power like states, conquering territories, collecting taxes, administering justice. They were a new form of imperialism, corporate and cold, where violence was justified not by religion or civilization, but by the bottom line. In India, the East India Company played Mughal princes against each other, offering loans and military support in exchange for trading rights. Slowly, gradually, they became the real power behind puppet rulers. When Indian soldiers in their employ, sepoys, rebelled in 1857, the British Crown finally took direct control. But by then, the pattern was set. The company had shown how a private entity could conquer a subcontinent, not through armies of citizens, but through hired soldiers, strategic alliances, and the ruthless application of economic pressure. The age of sails and shadows was the age when Europe discovered it could reshape the world. When small nations on the edge of one continent reached out and touched every other. When ships became bridges and oceans became highways. When gold and silver and spices and slaves flowed in one direction, and guns and diseases and new forms of domination flowed in the other. It was the age when the modern world was born, in violence, in exploitation, in the belief that some peoples had the right to rule others simply because they could. The empires of Rome and Mongolia had been vast, but they were still regional. This was different. This was global. And it was only the beginning. Something changed in the 19th century. Something that made all previous empires look almost quaint by comparison. The machine arrived. Steam hissed through engines, pistons pumped with mechanical precision, and suddenly, distance collapsed. Trains carried goods and soldiers across continents in days rather than months. Steamships crossed oceans regardless of wind or current. Telegraph wires sent messages around the world in minutes. And factories, great dark buildings that never slept, churned out products faster than any craftsman could imagine. Rifles, cannons, textiles, tools. Everything Europe needed to dominate, produced at a scale that defied comprehension. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how things were made. It changed why empires expanded. Before, conquest was about glory, about spreading religion, about gold and vaults and spices in markets. Now it was about something more systematic, more insatiable. Raw materials. Cotton from India and Egypt. Rubber from the Congo and Malaysia. Copper from Chile. Oil from Persia. Timber from Southeast Asia. The factories needed feeding, and the world became a pantry to be raided. And once the goods were manufactured, the colonies became captive markets, forced to buy European products even when they could make them cheaper themselves. Britain led the way. By the mid-1800s, the sun truly never set on the British Empire. A quarter of the world's land. 400 million people. Canada, India, Australia, vast swaths of Africa, islands scattered across every ocean. Queen Victoria's face appeared on stamps and coins from Hong Kong to Jamaica. British governors ruled from palaces while local populations labored in mines and plantations and docks, generating wealth that flowed back to London, Manchester, Liverpool. India became the crown jewel, the centerpiece of British power. The East India Company had done the dirty work of conquest, and now the British Crown reaped the rewards. They built railways across the subcontinent, not to help Indians travel, but to move resources efficiently to ports. Cotton grown in Indian fields was shipped to English mills, where it was woven into cloth and shipped back to India to be sold at prices Indian weavers couldn't match. The British destroyed India's own textile industry through tariffs and regulations, turning a land of skilled craftsmen into a supplier of raw materials and a market for finished goods. It was exploitation dressed up as modernization. The British spoke of their civilizing mission, the idea that they were bringing progress to backward peoples. They built schools that taught English, not local languages. They rewrote laws to match British standards, ignoring centuries of indigenous legal traditions. They mapped and surveyed and categorized, imposing order as they understood it. And they truly believed they were helping. British administrators wrote earnestly about the burden of empire, the responsibility to guide lesser peoples toward enlightenment. They couldn't see, or refused to see, that the poverty and chaos they pointed to were often caused by their own policies. The famines made this clear. Between 1876 and 1878, a drought struck southern India. Crops failed. In a functioning society, grain stores would have been opened, food redistributed, aid organized. But the British continued exporting grain from India even as millions starved. Free market principles, they said. Can't interfere with trade. Between 5 and 8 million Indians died. A few years later, another famine. And another. By some estimates, 30 million Indians died of preventable famine under British rule. The wealth flowed to Britain. The suffering stayed behind. But Britain was not alone in its industrial hunger. France rebuilt its own empire, still smarting from losses to Britain in the previous century. They took Algeria in 1830, a brutal conquest that lasted decades and killed hundreds of thousands. French settlers seized the best farmland. Algerians were pushed to the margins, their language suppressed, their culture dismissed as primitive. France called Algeria an integral part of France itself, as if calling something true could make it so. They expanded into West Africa, Indochina, islands in the Pacific. Wherever they went, the story was similar: extraction, suppression, the remaking of societies to serve French interests. Germany came late to the imperial feast, unified as a nation only in 1871. But they were hungry, desperate to prove themselves equals to Britain and France. They seized territories in Africa, Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, Togo. In Namibia, when the Herero and Nama peoples rebelled against German land seizures, the response was genocidal. German General Lothar von Trotha issued an extermination order. The Herero were driven into the desert, water holes poisoned, survivors imprisoned in concentration camps where they died by the thousands. It was a deliberate attempt to erase an entire people. Decades before the Holocaust, Germany practiced genocide in Africa. Belgium's King Leopold II watched the scramble for colonies and wanted his own piece of empire. But Belgium was small, and its parliament saw no need for expensive overseas ventures. So Leopold found a workaround: he would create a personal colony, owned not by Belgium but by himself. He called it the Congo Free State, a name dripping with irony. There was nothing free about it. Leopold claimed he wanted to bring civilization and Christianity to Central Africa, to end the Arab slave trade, to uplift the Congolese people. European leaders believed him, or pretended to. They recognized his claim to a territory 76 times the size of Belgium. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in the history of imperialism. Leopold wanted profit, and the Congo had rubber, wild rubber vines that grew throughout the jungle, suddenly invaluable as bicycles and automobiles created soaring demand. Congolese people were forced to harvest rubber under a quota system enforced with breathtaking brutality. Villages that failed to meet their quota were burned. Hostages were taken, women and children held until men brought enough rubber. Workers who didn't collect enough had their hands cut off as punishment and warning. The severed hands became symbols, proof that bullets hadn't been wasted on hunting, that they'd been used to enforce discipline. Baskets of smoked hands were presented to white officials. Children stared at the stumps where their hands had been. The population of the Congo, estimated at 20 million when Leopold took control, dropped by half. 10 million people. Dead from murder, starvation, disease, exhaustion. All so that Leopold could build monuments in Brussels and die wealthy, never once setting foot in the land he destroyed. When reports of these atrocities finally reached Europe, there was outrage. Writers like Joseph Conrad published Heart of Darkness, exposing the horror. Activists like E.D. Morel and Roger Casement documented the crimes with photographs and testimony. International pressure mounted. In 1908, the Belgian government finally took the Congo from Leopold, and conditions improved, marginally. The killing became less overt, but the exploitation continued. The Congo's vast mineral wealth, copper, diamonds, later uranium, was still extracted for European benefit, and the Congolese people remained subjects, not citizens. Across Africa, European powers were drawing lines on maps, carving up a continent they barely understood. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85 brought them together: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Italy. No Africans were invited to this meeting about Africa's future. They sat in a hall in Germany and negotiated borders, trading territories like cards in a game. Rivers became boundaries. Straight lines cut through kingdoms, through ethnic groups, through lands that had been connected for centuries. The map they created ignored everything about how Africans actually lived, how they organized themselves, where their loyalties lay. These borders would cause conflicts that still rage today. Groups that had been united found themselves in different colonies, subject to different laws, different languages, different masters. Traditional enemies were forced into the same territories. When independence finally came in the 20th century, these artificial borders remained, and the tensions they created exploded into civil wars, genocides, endless cycles of violence. The men in Berlin didn't care about any of that. They were dividing resources, not people. Claiming land, not considering lives. The motivations were dressed in noble language. The civilizing mission. The white man's burden, a phrase coined by Rudyard Kipling in a poem urging America to take the Philippines. The idea that Europeans had a moral duty to uplift supposedly inferior races, to bring Christianity and commerce and culture to the dark places of the earth. It was racism wrapped in paternalism, exploitation justified by a sense of superiority so complete that it seemed natural, obvious, unquestionable. And many Europeans truly believed it. Missionaries arrived alongside merchants and soldiers, convinced they were saving souls. They built schools and hospitals, taught reading and writing, and genuinely cared for the people they served. But they also demanded conversion, suppressed local religions, punished children for speaking their own languages. They saw indigenous cultures not as different but as wrong, not as complex but as primitive. Their kindness came with conditions: become like us or remain in darkness. The technology made resistance harder than ever before. When Africans fought back, and they did, constantly, they faced Maxim guns, weapons that could fire 600 rounds per minute. At the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan, British forces killed 10,000 Sudanese warriors in a single morning while losing fewer than 50 of their own. It wasn't warfare. It was slaughter. The technological gap had become so vast that courage meant nothing. Spears and swords and even older rifles couldn't compete with industrial killing machines. In Asia, the pattern continued. Britain tightened its grip on India after the Sepoy Rebellion, ruling with a heavier hand, trusting local leaders less. France conquered Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, creating French Indochina. The Dutch consolidated control over Indonesia. Britain took Burma, adding it to their Indian Empire. China, still enormous and ancient, was carved into spheres of influence, where European powers and Japan controlled trade, collected taxes, and acted like owners without formally annexing territory. It was imperialism without bothering with the paperwork. The United States joined the Imperial Club late, and with considerable internal debate. Americans prided themselves on being anti-colonial. Their nation had been born in rebellion against empire, after all. But as the 19th century closed, that revolutionary spirit collided with ambition and opportunity. In 1898, the Spanish-American War gave the United States its chance. Spain's empire was crumbling, and America stepped in to claim the pieces. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and most controversially, the Philippines. Filipino revolutionaries had been fighting Spain for independence. When American ships arrived, the revolutionaries saw them as liberators, as fellow fighters against colonial oppression. They helped the Americans defeat Spanish forces, expecting freedom as their reward. Instead, the United States claimed the Philippines as its own territory. When Filipinos resisted, when they demanded the independence they'd been promised, America responded with force. What followed was a brutal war, torture, massacres, the burning of villages, concentration camps. American soldiers wrote letters home describing killing niggers, with the same casual racism that justified atrocities in Africa. Between 200,000 and 1 million Filipinos died, most of them civilians. America called it benevolent assimilation. President McKinley said he prayed about it and decided that America had a duty to educate the Filipinos, and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. Never mind that the Philippines had been Catholic for 300 years under Spanish rule. The language was different, but the logic was the same: we know better, we have the right to rule, resistance is savagery. Japan watched all of this and learned. For centuries, Japan had been isolated, closed to most foreign contact. Then, in 1853, American warships under Commodore Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay and demanded trade relations. Japan, lacking the technology to resist, was forced to sign unequal treaties. But rather than becoming colonized, Japan decided to become a colonizer. They studied Western nations obsessively, their technology, their military organization, their imperial strategies. The Meiji Restoration transformed Japan in decades from a feudal society into an industrial power. And then Japan began its own expansion. They took Taiwan from China. They defeated Russia in a war that shocked the world, the first time an Asian power had beaten a European one using modern military technology. They annexed Korea, brutally suppressing Korean culture and identity. They pushed into Manchuria. Japan's empire was built on the same logic as Europe's: the strong had the right to rule the weak, expansion was natural and necessary, and conquered peoples existed to serve the empire's needs. By the early 20th century, the map of the world was almost entirely colored by imperial powers. The Americas were divided between the United States and the remnants of Spanish and Portuguese colonies. Africa was a patchwork of European claims, with only Ethiopia and Liberia remaining independent. Asia was carved into colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence. The Pacific Islands were divided among European powers, America, and Japan. Antarctica remained unclaimed, but only because it was too inhospitable to exploit profitably. The empires told themselves they were bringing progress, and in some ways, they were. Railways and telegraphs connected distant regions. Modern medicine reduced mortality from certain diseases. Education spread literacy. But every benefit came at a cost paid by the colonized. The railways moved resources out, not development in. The medicine was for colonial administrators and plantation owners first, locals second. The education taught children to despise their own cultures and languages, to see themselves through the eyes of their conquerors. And the wealth extraction was staggering. India, once one of the richest regions on earth, was systematically drained. Estimates suggest that Britain extracted $45 trillion of wealth from India over 2 centuries of rule. Africa's resources, gold, diamonds, copper, rubber, ivory, human beings, flowed to Europe in quantities that built fortunes and funded empires. The labor was local, the profits were not. The pattern held everywhere: the colonies produced, the empires consumed. Resistance never stopped, but it took many forms. Sometimes armed rebellion, uprisings that were crushed with overwhelming force. Sometimes passive resistance, work slowdowns, quiet sabotage, the preservation of banned languages and religions in secret. Sometimes adaptation, learning the colonizers' language and laws to advocate for rights within the system. Leaders emerged who would eventually challenge empire itself, but their moment hadn't yet come. In 1900, the imperial powers seemed invincible, their dominance unquestionable, their right to rule accepted as natural law by most of the people who held power. But empires, as history had shown again and again, contained the seeds of their own destruction. The very technologies that made industrial imperialism possible, the trains, the telegraphs, the printing presses, also allowed resistance to organize and communicate. The educated classes that colonial powers created to help administer their empires would become the ones who demanded freedom. The ideas of liberty and democracy that Europeans claimed as their heritage would be turned back on them by colonized peoples asking why such principles didn't apply to everyone. And the empires themselves were heading toward a catastrophe that would shake their foundations. 2 world wars were coming, conflicts so devastating that they would shatter the certainty of European superiority. The industrial technology that had made conquest so easy would be turned inward, destroying European cities, killing millions of Europeans, bankrupting the imperial powers. The age of industrial empire was reaching its peak. But peaks, by definition, are followed by descent. The fall was coming, and when it arrived, the world would be forever changed. The 20th century opened with empires at their zenith, confident and gleaming, certain that their dominance would last forever. But beneath the surface, tensions were building, rivalries over colonies, competition for resources, tangled alliances that turned every dispute into a potential catastrophe. In the summer of 1914, an assassin's bullet in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction that no one could stop. Within weeks, Europe was at war. Within months, the world was burning. The First World War was supposed to be short, glorious, over by Christmas. Instead, it became a grinding nightmare of trenches and mud, poison gas and machine guns, millions of young men dying for a few yards of shattered ground. But it wasn't just a European war. The empires dragged their colonies into the conflict. Indian soldiers fought in France. African troops carried supplies through East African jungles. Australian and New Zealand forces died at Gallipoli. The colonized peoples were promised that their loyalty would be rewarded, that after the war, things would change. They believed, and they fought, and they died in staggering numbers. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Europe, found itself on the losing side. For centuries, it had controlled vast territories, from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula, from North Africa to the edges of Persia. But now it was the sick man of Europe, weakened by corruption and military defeats. When the war ended in 1918, the victorious Allies carved up Ottoman lands like butchers dividing a carcass. Britain took Iraq and Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. New nations were created with borders drawn by men who had never walked those lands, who didn't speak the languages or understand the histories. In the Arabian Peninsula, the British had made promises to Arab leaders, help us defeat the Ottomans, and you'll have independence. But they'd also made promises to the French, we'll divide the Middle East between us. And they'd made promises to Zionist leaders, Palestine will become a homeland for the Jewish people. 3 incompatible promises, all made in secret, all designed to serve British interests. When the contradictions emerged, when Arabs realized they'd been betrayed, the seeds of a century of conflict were planted. The Russian Empire collapsed into revolution. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for 300 years, was swept away by workers and soldiers tired of dying for a system that gave them nothing. The Bolsheviks seized power, promising peace, land, and bread. They pulled Russia out of the war and began the difficult work of building something new, the Soviet Union, a state that rejected imperialism in theory while practicing it in fact. The conquered territories of the old Russian Empire, Ukraine, Central Asia, the Caucasus, were absorbed into the new Soviet system, their independence movements crushed, their resources exploited in the name of socialist progress. Germany, defeated and humiliated, lost its overseas empire entirely. Britain and France divided German colonies in Africa and the Pacific among themselves, calling them mandates rather than colonies, as if the new name made the occupation any less colonial. Germany was forced to accept sole blame for the war, to pay crushing reparations, to watch as its territory was carved away. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't peace, it was punishment. And from that humiliation, a darker force would eventually rise. But something else was rising too, a new kind of resistance. The colonized peoples who had fought in the war returned home with questions. They'd seen European nations slaughter each other with industrial efficiency. They'd watched the so-called civilized world descend into barbarism. They'd fought alongside white soldiers and proven themselves equals in courage and skill. And they'd heard the rhetoric, the war was fought for freedom, for democracy, for the rights of small nations. If those principles applied in Europe, why not in Asia, in Africa, in the Caribbean? In India, Mohandas Gandhi began organizing resistance on a massive scale. He'd spent years in South Africa fighting racial discrimination, developing a philosophy of nonviolent resistance. Now he brought those ideas home. Civil disobedience. Peaceful protests. Refusal to cooperate with unjust laws. When the British massacred nearly 400 unarmed protesters at Amritsar in 1919, firing into a trapped crowd until their ammunition ran out, something broke. Indians who had been loyal to the empire began to question their allegiance. Gandhi's movement grew, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum that even imprisonment and violence couldn't stop. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 had been crushed brutally, its leaders executed by firing squad. But the executions transformed the rebels into martyrs. Irish sentiment shifted from demanding home rule within the empire to demanding complete independence. A bitter war followed, ambushes and assassinations, reprisals and terror. The British sent in the Black and Tans, paramilitaries who burned villages and killed civilians. Ireland bled, and finally, in 1921, the British agreed to partition. The Irish Free State was born, though the northern counties remained British, a division that would spawn decades of violence. It was the first major crack in the empire, proof that even Britain could be forced to retreat. Across Africa, the war had shown colonial subjects that their masters were not invincible. African soldiers had fought in European armies, seen white men die just as easily as anyone else, watched Europeans beg and plead and panic in the face of death. The myth of racial superiority became harder to maintain. In the decades after the war, Pan-African movements began to organize, connecting struggles across the continent, imagining a future without European rule. But that future seemed distant. The imperial powers, despite their losses, clung to their colonies with renewed determination. The colonies were more valuable than ever, sources of raw materials, markets for manufactured goods, strategic positions in a world where another war seemed increasingly likely. Britain and France, exhausted by the Great War, couldn't afford to lose their empires. The colonies were what kept them solvent, what maintained their status as great powers. The 1920s and 30s brought economic collapse. The Great Depression spread across the globe, and the colonies suffered worst of all. Cash crop economies crashed when demand evaporated. Peasants who'd been forced to grow cotton or coffee instead of food now had neither income nor sustenance. Colonial governments offered little relief. Their priority was maintaining order and ensuring that whatever wealth remained still flowed back to Europe. Hunger and desperation grew, and with them, anger. In China, the situation was even more complex. The Qing dynasty had fallen in 1911, ending thousands of years of imperial rule. But what replaced it was chaos, warlords fighting for territory, foreign powers maintaining their spheres of influence, Japanese aggression in Manchuria. Chinese nationalists and communists both fought for control, each offering a different vision of China's future. But they agreed on one thing: the century of humiliation, the period when foreign powers had carved up China and imposed unequal treaties, had to end. China would be strong again, united again, free from foreign domination. Japan, meanwhile, had its own imperial dreams. The global depression hit Japan hard, and military leaders argued that expansion was the answer. They invaded Manchuria in 1931, establishing a puppet state. The League of Nations condemned the action but did nothing. Japan learned that the old imperial powers were weak, that international law was meaningless without enforcement. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The rape of Nanking saw Japanese soldiers massacre hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians in an orgy of violence that shocked the world. But still, the Western powers did little. They had their own problems, their own fears. In Europe, Germany was rising again. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party promised to restore Germany's greatness, to reclaim lost territory, to build an empire that would last 1,000 years. Hitler's ideology was imperialism taken to its logical extreme, a racial hierarchy with Germans at the top, Slavs and others as inferior peoples to be enslaved or exterminated, Jews as vermin to be destroyed. It was colonial logic brought home to Europe itself. The same attitudes that had justified the Congo's horrors, the same racial theories that had excused genocide in Namibia, now turned inward. When Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, the Second World War began. And this time, it was clear from the start that this was a war of annihilation, a conflict that would reshape the world completely. The European powers that had carved up the globe now fought desperately for survival. Britain stood alone after France fell in 1940, its cities bombed, its people rationed, its future uncertain. The empire was mobilized again, soldiers from India, from Africa, from the Caribbean fought to defend the nation that ruled them. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of Nazi aggression. Hitler saw the Slavic peoples as subhuman, their lands as Lebensraum, living space for German settlers. The Eastern Front became a landscape of unimaginable carnage. Entire cities were destroyed. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians died. But the Soviets held, and slowly, painfully, they began to push back. At Stalingrad, the tide turned. The German war machine, which had seemed unstoppable, began to break. In Asia, Japan's empire expanded rapidly after Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. They took the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, Indonesia. All the European colonies in Southeast Asia fell within months. The Japanese called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, claiming they were liberating Asians from Western imperialism. And some colonized peoples did see them that way, at first. But Japanese rule proved just as brutal as European colonialism, perhaps worse. Forced labor, mass executions, comfort women, systematic sexual slavery. The liberators became new oppressors. The war consumed everything. Cities became rubble. 60 million people died, soldiers and civilians, combatants and innocents, entire families erased, entire communities destroyed. The Holocaust revealed the depths of industrial murder, 6 million Jews killed in factories of death designed with cold efficiency. But the Jews were not alone. Roma, Slavs, disabled people, political prisoners, homosexuals, anyone the Nazis deemed unworthy of life. It was imperialism's ultimate expression, the belief that some lives simply didn't matter, that entire peoples could be eliminated to make room for those deemed superior. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the world witnessed a new kind of destruction. Cities vaporized in seconds. Shadows burned into stone where people had stood. Radiation sickness that killed slowly, painfully, for years afterward. The bombs ended the war, but they also marked a new era, one where human beings possessed the power to destroy civilization itself. The old empires had fought with rifles and cannons. Now nations could wield the fire of the sun. The war's end left Europe in ruins. Britain had won, but at a cost it couldn't afford. The empire was bankrupt, its cities damaged, its people exhausted. France had been occupied and humiliated. Germany was divided and occupied. The old powers were broken, and two new superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Neither had been traditional colonial empires, and both spoke the language of anti-imperialism, though both would create their own forms of domination in the decades to come. The colonized peoples saw their moment. They had fought in the war, died for empires that promised freedom but delivered continued subjugation. Now they demanded what they'd been denied for so long, independence. And the old powers, weakened and poor, couldn't hold on the way they once had. The age of decolonization was beginning, though it would be neither quick nor painless. India led the way. Gandhi's non-violent movement had grown throughout the war, and Britain finally acknowledged the inevitable. In 1947, India gained independence, but at a terrible cost. The subcontinent was partitioned into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The borders were drawn hastily, carelessly. Millions found themselves on the wrong side of the new lines. Religious violence erupted. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs turned on each other in an explosion of communal hatred. Between 1 and 2 million died in the partition violence. 15 million were displaced, forced to abandon homes their families had occupied for generations. Gandhi himself was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist who thought he'd been too accommodating to Muslims. The partition was colonialism's final gift to India, arbitrary borders that ignored how people actually lived, divisions that served imperial convenience rather than local reality, conflicts that would simmer for decades. India and Pakistan would fight 3 wars, and the Kashmir dispute remains unresolved today. But still, independence had come. The jewel in Britain's crown had broken free. Indonesia followed in 1949, after a brutal war against the Dutch who tried to reclaim their colony. Vietnam declared independence from France in 1945, though the French refused to accept it, leading to a war that would drag on for 9 years before France finally admitted defeat. Ghana became independent in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African colony to break free, led by Kwame Nkrumah, who spoke of Pan-African unity and a future where Africans controlled their own destiny. The 1960s became the Year of Africa, as 17 nations gained independence. The map changed month by month, color by color, as European flags came down and new ones rose. Sometimes the transition was peaceful, negotiated settlements where the colonizers accepted the inevitable. But often it was violent. Algeria's independence from France required 8 years of savage warfare. The French saw Algeria as part of France itself, and they fought to keep it with torture, collective punishment, and massacres. When Algeria finally won its freedom in 1962, 1 million people were dead, and 1 million French settlers fled, abandoning homes they'd occupied for generations. Britain's retreat was more orderly, but no less cynical. They left behind carefully constructed systems designed to protect their interests even in independence. In many colonies, they created constitutions that favored minorities who'd been allied with colonial rule, setting up conflicts that would erupt once British troops left. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising was crushed with detention camps and mass killings before independence was granted. In Rhodesia, white settlers unilaterally declared independence rather than accept majority rule, leading to 15 years of civil war. The Portuguese held on longest, refusing to grant independence until 1975, after a revolution at home finally toppled their dictatorship. Angola and Mozambique gained freedom only to plunge immediately into civil wars, as Cold War superpowers funded rival factions, turning independence struggles into proxy battles between capitalism and communism. The colonial powers left, but they didn't disappear. They remained through economic ties, through debt, through corporations that still controlled the most valuable resources. And the borders remained, those arbitrary lines drawn in Berlin and Paris and London, lines that ignored ethnic boundaries, historical kingdoms, natural resources. When independence came, new nations were trapped within borders that made little sense, ruling over peoples who often had no shared identity, no common language, no reason to be united except that Europeans had drawn a line around them on a map. These borders would fuel conflicts for generations, civil wars in Nigeria, Sudan, Rwanda, Congo. Artificial nations struggling to become real ones, while the former colonizers watched from a distance, occasionally intervening when their interests were threatened, but rarely accepting responsibility for the chaos their empires had created. By 1975, formal empire was mostly dead. The world map showed independent nations from Asia to Africa to the Caribbean. The age of empires, which had begun thousands of years earlier, seemed finally to be over. But appearances deceive. The structures of empire remained, transformed but persistent, adapted to a world where overt colonialism was no longer acceptable but exploitation continued under new names. The empires had fallen, but their ghosts walked on, shaping a world they no longer officially controlled. The empires are gone, their flags folded away, their governors returned home. But if you look closely at the world today, you can see their fingerprints everywhere. In the languages spoken on every continent. In the borders that spark endless conflict. In the wealth concentrated in certain nations while others struggle to survive. In the very way we organize society, think about progress, understand our place in the world. Imperialism didn't end, it evolved. It shed its most obvious forms and learned to operate in shadows, through systems so deeply embedded that we often forget they were constructed by human hands, for human purposes, in service of human greed. Start with language. English is spoken by billions, not because it's inherently superior or more efficient, but because Britain once controlled a quarter of the world. French remains an official language across Africa, not by choice but by colonial imposition. Spanish and Portuguese dominate the Americas because conquistadors brought those languages on the edges of swords. When children in Nigeria or India or Jamaica learn English as their primary language in school, they're living inside empire's legacy. Their own languages, Igbo, Tamil, Patois, are often dismissed as dialects, as inferior, as obstacles to progress. The colonizers left, but they left their words behind, reshaping how entire populations think and dream. The borders tell the same story. Look at a map of Africa, straight lines cutting through deserts, through forests, dividing peoples who share languages and cultures, forcing together groups who have been separate for centuries. The Middle East's endless conflicts trace back to borders drawn by British and French diplomats who'd never set foot in the region. Sykes-Picot, the secret agreement that carved up Ottoman lands, created nations like Iraq that combined Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations with no history of unified governance. When those tensions explode into violence, when Syria burns and Libya fractures and Yemen starves, we're watching the delayed detonation of colonial borders. South Asia's partition created wounds that still bleed. India and Pakistan, born in the same moment from the same land, have fought 3 wars and remain nuclear-armed rivals separated by a militarized border. Bangladesh broke away from Pakistan in a brutal civil war in 1971. Kashmir remains disputed, a beautiful valley turned into a military zone where both sides claim sovereignty and the people caught between suffer the consequences. Britain drew these lines hastily, carelessly, and left before the full consequences became clear. Even the concept of the nation-state itself is a colonial export. Many societies organize themselves differently, as tribal confederations, as city-states, as kingdoms with fluid borders, as civilizations without hard territorial boundaries. The modern nation-state, with its fixed borders, centralized government, and claim to exclusive sovereignty, was imposed globally during the colonial era. Indigenous governance systems were dismissed as primitive, replaced with European models that often fit poorly with local realities. When these imposed systems fail, when nations collapse into warlordism or authoritarian rule, it's partly because the foundation was never solid to begin with. The economic legacy runs even deeper. The Industrial Revolution created a division of labor that persists today. Former colonies produce raw materials, former imperial powers process them into valuable goods. Ghana grows cocoa but imports chocolate. Ivory Coast exports coffee beans but drinks instant coffee made elsewhere. Congo mines cobalt for smartphones but most Congolese will never own one. The pattern repeats across the global south, countries rich in resources but poor in wealth, exporting what they dig from the ground, importing what others make from it. This isn't accident or natural economic law. It's the result of deliberate policies that continue long after independence. Colonial powers destroyed local industries to eliminate competition. They built infrastructure designed for extraction, railways running from mines to ports, roads connecting plantations to shipping docks, but little connecting local communities to each other. When independence came, this infrastructure remained, and the economic relationships it served continued. The former colonies tried to industrialize, but they faced tariffs, debts, and structural adjustment programs that forced them to keep playing their assigned role in the global economy. Debt became the new chains. Former colonies needed capital to develop, so they borrowed from institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, institutions controlled by wealthy nations. When they couldn't repay loans, they were forced to accept structural adjustment programs that required privatizing public services, cutting social spending, opening markets to foreign corporations. These programs enriched foreign companies and local elites while ordinary people lost access to healthcare, education, and basic services. It was extraction by financial means, imperialism through economics rather than armies. Land ownership patterns cemented inequality across former colonies. In Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, white settlers had seized the best farmland during colonial rule. When independence came, pressure mounted for land reform, returning stolen land to those who'd been displaced. But the former colonial powers protected their settlers through economic pressure and diplomatic maneuvering. In Zimbabwe, when Robert Mugabe finally pursued aggressive land redistribution in the 2000s, the results were chaotic: farms destroyed, food security shattered, the economy collapsed. It became a cautionary tale used to resist land reform elsewhere, yet the underlying injustice remained unresolved. Those who'd stolen the land kept it, and those whose ancestors had been dispossessed remained landless. The extraction of human capital continues in new forms. Brain drain pulls the best-educated people from developing nations to wealthy ones. Doctors trained in Nigeria work in British hospitals. Engineers educated in India program computers in Silicon Valley. The poor nations invest in education, and the rich nations harvest the results. It's a transfer of wealth in reverse, developing countries subsidizing developed ones by training their workforce. And when those skilled workers send money home to support their families, it's counted as remittances and celebrated as foreign aid, as if it's charity rather than wages earned. Multinational corporations operate with power that rivals the old colonial companies. They negotiate directly with governments, often dictating terms that favor extraction over local development. Mining companies operate in Congo much as Leopold's agents did, taking resources, leaving pollution and poverty. Tech companies mine data in developing nations while profits flow to Silicon Valley. Oil companies drill in Nigeria, and the oil spills poison fishing waters, while the wealth flows to Houston and London. The flags are different, but the pattern is familiar. When nations try to break this pattern, to nationalize resources or redistribute wealth, they face consequences. Iran nationalized its oil industry in 1953, and the CIA orchestrated a coup to restore Western control. Guatemala elected a president who wanted land reform in 1954, and the United States overthrew him to protect United Fruit Company's interests. Chile elected Salvador Allende, a socialist who promised to redistribute wealth, and the U.S. supported a military coup that installed Pinocchio's brutal dictatorship. The methods were covert, but the message was clear: certain kinds of independence would not be tolerated. This became the pattern of the Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union both claimed to oppose imperialism while practicing their own versions. The Soviets invaded Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan, crushing movements that threatened their control. They called it defending socialism, but it looked remarkably like empire. The Americans intervened constantly in Latin America, Asia, Africa, always claiming to defend freedom while usually protecting economic interests. They called it containment, spreading democracy, fighting communism. But the people being bombed or having their governments overthrown experienced it as imperialism by another name. The language shifted. No one spoke of colonies anymore, they were developing nations, the third world, emerging markets. Foreign aid replaced tribute, but it often came with strings attached, requirements to buy goods from donor nations, to adopt specific policies, to align with donor interests. Military bases replaced colonial garrisons. The United States maintains over 800 military installations in more than 70 countries. They're not called empire, but they serve similar functions: projecting power, protecting resources, ensuring compliant governments. Cultural imperialism operates more subtly. Hollywood exports American values worldwide. McDonald's and Coca-Cola become symbols of modernity. Western fashion, music, beauty standards spread globally, not through force but through the soft power of media and marketing. Local cultures adapt or resist, but the pressure is constant. Children in rural India grow up watching American superhero movies. Teenagers in Ghana listen to American rap. There's nothing inherently wrong with cultural exchange, but when the flow is primarily one direction, when local cultures are dismissed as backward and Western culture as universal, it echoes the civilizing mission's logic. Education systems perpetuate these patterns. History is taught from Western perspectives. African history before colonialism is dismissed as prehistory, as if societies without writing had no history worth recording. Indigenous knowledge systems are ignored in favor of Western science, even though those traditional systems often contain sophisticated understanding developed over millennia. Children learn about European explorers discovering continents where millions already lived. They learn that civilization spread from Europe outward, that progress means becoming more Western. The curriculum itself is colonial, teaching people to see their own cultures through colonizers' eyes. The environmental legacy of imperialism shapes the climate crisis we face today. The Industrial Revolution that powered European expansion was built on coal, on forests cleared for plantations, on ecosystems destroyed for profit. The carbon that's warming the planet was mostly emitted by wealthy nations during their rise to power. But the consequences fall hardest on the global south: droughts in Africa, flooding in Bangladesh, rising seas threatening Pacific islands. The nations that contributed least to climate change suffer most, while those most responsible have the resources to adapt and protect themselves. It's environmental imperialism, where the powerful externalize the costs of their prosperity onto the powerless. The International Criminal Court prosecutes war crimes, but mostly in Africa. Western nations refuse to submit to its jurisdiction while demanding others do. When American soldiers commit atrocities, they're tried in American courts under American law. When African leaders commit similar crimes, they face international prosecution. The pattern reinforces old hierarchies: some nations are subject to international law, others consider themselves above it. Justice becomes selective, applied to the weak but not the strong, continuing the imperial logic that different rules apply to different peoples. Even humanitarian intervention carries echoes of the civilizing mission. When Western nations bomb countries in the name of human rights, when they impose sanctions that starve civilians to pressure governments, when they decide which atrocities deserve intervention and which can be ignored, they're exercising imperial prerogatives. The language has changed. No one speaks of the white man's burden anymore. Now it's the responsibility to protect, humanitarian intervention, spreading democracy. But the underlying assumption remains, that Western nations have the right and duty to decide how others should live, to enforce those decisions with military power, to reshape societies according to Western ideals. The pharmaceutical industry reveals similar patterns. Drugs are developed using knowledge from indigenous peoples, traditional medicines tested and synthesized, but the patents are owned by Western corporations. When AIDS ravaged Africa, pharmaceutical companies insisted on patent protections that made treatment unaffordable, choosing profits over millions of lives. When COVID-19 emerged, wealthy nations hoarded vaccines while poor nations waited, and pharmaceutical companies fought against sharing the technology needed to manufacture vaccines locally. Bodies in the global south are still valued less than profits in the global north. Tourism has become a new form of exploitation. Wealthy travelers visit former colonies, stay in resorts that employ locals as servants, take photos of exotic poverty, and return home feeling worldly. Sex tourism thrives in Southeast Asia and the Caribbean, where economic desperation makes bodies available for purchase. Volunteer tourism sends well-meaning people to help communities, often doing more harm than good, perpetuating the savior narrative while ignoring structural problems. The tourists feel good, the tour operators profit, and the local communities remain trapped in poverty's performance. Social media spreads these patterns globally. Instagram influencers pose in front of African children, white saviorism repackaged for the digital age. Travel bloggers exoticize cultures for clicks and ad revenue. The male gaze, the Western gaze, continues to define how the rest of the world is seen and represented. Algorithms amplify Western perspectives while suppressing non-Western voices. Tech companies based in Silicon Valley decide what billions see, what gets censored, what's considered misinformation. It's editorial control on a scale that would make colonial newspaper editors envious. Yet resistance continues, as it always has. Indigenous movements fight to preserve languages, lands, and ways of life. Environmental defenders risk their lives protecting forests from logging companies and mines. Activists challenge neocolonial systems through organizing, protest, and building alternative economies. Intellectuals decolonize knowledge, recovering suppressed histories, challenging Western frameworks, creating space for different ways of understanding the world. The Black Lives Matter movement connected police violence in America to colonial systems of racial control. Protests toppled statues of slavers and colonizers, sparking debates about memory and history. Young people in former colonies learn their own histories, not the sanitized versions colonizers taught. Artists reclaim their cultural heritage, creating work that centers their experiences rather than performing for Western audiences. These movements understand that decolonization isn't just about political independence, it's about dismantling the mental structures imperialism created, the hierarchies it normalized, the stories it told about who matters and who doesn't. But the work is incomplete and perhaps can never be truly complete. The world was reshaped so fundamentally by imperialism that returning to some pre-colonial state is impossible. Too much was destroyed. Too many connections were forged. Too many populations were mixed. The question isn't how to go back, but how to move forward in ways that acknowledge the past, repair what can be repaired, and build something more just. Reparations remain controversial. When former colonies demand compensation for centuries of extraction, former imperial powers balk. They argue that modern citizens shouldn't be held responsible for historical crimes, that the statute of limitations has expired, that the complexity makes calculations impossible. But they rarely return what was stolen: the artifacts in British museums, the wealth that built European cities, the land deeds that still grant ownership of stolen property. They keep the benefits of imperialism while rejecting responsibility for its costs. Some nations have attempted reconciliation in smaller ways. Germany paid reparations to Israel for the Holocaust, acknowledging that some debts cannot be erased but must at least be acknowledged. Belgium finally apologized for atrocities in the Congo, though the apology came more than a century late and offered no material compensation. Britain expressed regret for certain colonial massacres while carefully avoiding language that might create legal liability. These gestures matter, but they're incomplete: words without restitution, acknowledgement without transformation. The question of who owes what to whom becomes complicated when borders have shifted, when empires have fallen, when centuries have passed. Should modern Turkey compensate Armenia for genocide committed by the Ottoman Empire? Should descendants of slaves in America receive reparations, and if so, from whom? The federal government, the states where slavery was practiced, the corporations that profited? Should Britain compensate India, and if so, how do you calculate the value of 200 years of extraction? These questions have no easy answers, but avoiding them because they're difficult perpetuates injustice. Migration patterns reveal how imperialism reshaped human geography. People move from former colonies to former imperial centers, reversing the flow. Algerians in France, Indians and Pakistanis in Britain, Indonesians in the Netherlands, they're often met with resentment, told they don't belong, blamed for social problems. But their presence is empire's echo, a consequence of connections forged through conquest. The languages they speak, the educations they received, even the desire to migrate to these specific places, all of it traces back to colonial relationships. When European nations complain about immigration, they're complaining about imperialism's consequences while denying responsibility for creating them. Refugee crises similarly connect to imperial legacies. Syria's civil war has roots in borders drawn by France and Britain. Afghanistan's decades of conflict began with Cold War proxy battles, when the US and Soviet Union turned the country into a battlefield. Libya collapsed after Western intervention removed Gaddafi without planning for what came next. The refugees fleeing these conflicts often head to the nations whose policies contributed to the chaos. Yet they're turned away, detained in camps, drowned in the Mediterranean while Europe debates how few it can accept rather than acknowledging its role in creating the crises. Climate refugees will make current migration pale by comparison. As sea levels rise, as droughts intensify, as farmland becomes desert, millions will be forced to move. The nations that contributed most to climate change will face pressure from those who contributed least but suffer most. Will wealthy nations accept them, given that their own emissions cause the displacement? Or will they build walls and deploy navies to keep climate refugees out, preserving their prosperity while externalizing the consequences? The question is imperialism's ultimate test: whether humanity can break from patterns of exploitation or will simply find new forms for them. Technology creates new frontiers for domination. Rare earth minerals needed for smartphones and electric cars are mined in Congo under conditions Leopold would recognize. Cobalt is extracted by children working in dangerous conditions for subsistence wages while tech executives become billionaires. The supply chains are long and complex, designed to obscure exploitation, to distance consumers from the violence that makes their devices possible. You can hold a smartphone without seeing the child who mined its components, without knowing the environmental destruction its materials required. Technology isn't neutral, it carries forward old patterns of extraction dressed in modern sleekness. Artificial intelligence and automation threaten to deepen global inequalities. If wealthy nations automate manufacturing, they won't need cheap labor from developing countries. Those nations lose even the exploitative opportunities that globalization provided. Meanwhile, AI systems trained on Western data perpetuate Western biases, facial recognition that works poorly on darker skin, translation systems that default to masculine pronouns, recommendation algorithms that amplify existing prejudices. The digital future risks being as unequal as the analog past, with the same nations dominating, the same populations marginalized. Space exploration evokes similar concerns. As nations and corporations plan to mine asteroids and colonize other planets, they use language eerily reminiscent of colonialism: frontiers to conquer, resources to exploit, new worlds to claim. Who will benefit from space resources? Will they be shared equitably or claimed by whoever has the technology to reach them first? Will Mars become another site of exploitation, with corporations extracting resources while workers labor in dangerous conditions, or can humanity learn from history and build something different? The pandemic revealed how little has changed. Wealthy nations hoarded vaccines, securing doses for their populations many times over while poor nations waited. Pharmaceutical companies prioritized profits over global health. India, which manufactures much of the world's medicine, suffered vaccine shortages because companies exported doses to nations that paid more. The World Trade Organization's patent protections, designed to benefit wealthy nations, prevented poor nations from manufacturing their own vaccines. It was a perfect encapsulation of neocolonialism, systems designed to extract value from poor nations while ensuring wealth accumulates in rich ones. Education about imperialism remains contentious. In many former imperial nations, the violence is downplayed, the exploitation minimized. British students learn about the empire's reach but not about famines in India, massacres in Kenya, or concentration camps in South Africa. French curricula emphasize France's civilizing mission while glossing over torture in Algeria and slavery in Haiti. American textbooks talk about westward expansion without using the word genocide. The sanitized histories protect national myths while denying descendants of the colonized the full truth of what happened to their ancestors. In contrast, some nations grapple more honestly with their pasts. Germany's confrontation with the Holocaust, though it took decades, became a model for reckoning with historical atrocity. German students visit concentration camps, the nation erected memorials, laws prohibit Holocaust denial. It's not perfect. Germany has been slower to acknowledge its colonial genocides in Africa, but it demonstrates that nations can face their darkest chapters and emerge with greater moral clarity. The question is whether other former imperial powers will follow this path or continue protecting comfortable myths. Museums become battlegrounds for these contested histories. Should the British Museum return the Parthenon marbles to Greece, the Benin bronzes to Nigeria, the Rosetta Stone to Egypt? The museum argues it preserves these artifacts for humanity, that it provides access and protection. But this argument echoes colonial logic, that Europeans are better custodians of others' heritage, that Western institutions should control global culture. The artifacts were taken through conquest and theft, yet they remain in London, generating tourist revenue, enhancing Britain's prestige, while their countries of origin must beg for their return. When artifacts are returned, it's rarely simple. The Benin bronzes, looted when British forces destroyed the Kingdom of Benin in 1897, are scattered across museums worldwide. Some have been returned, but thousands remain. Who should receive them? The Nigerian federal government, the state where Benin is located, descendants of Benin's royal family, or new museums built specifically to house them. Colonial theft created diaspora not just of people but of culture, and untangling that web requires difficult conversations about authority, ownership, and heritage. Language preservation fights against imperialism's linguistic homogenization. Indigenous languages disappear at alarming rates. One dies roughly every 2 weeks. When a language vanishes, so does the knowledge it contains: environmental understanding, oral histories, ways of thinking that don't translate directly into dominant languages. Efforts to preserve and revitalize these languages resist cultural genocide's ongoing effects. Their acts of resistance, assertions that colonized peoples have the right to think, dream, and express themselves in their ancestors' words rather than colonizers' tongues. Food systems reflect imperial histories. Cuisine that seems traditional often includes ingredients introduced through colonial networks. Italian tomatoes came from the Americas. Indian chilies originated in Mexico. European sugar, coffee, and tea habits were built on plantation slavery. Even the hamburger depends on cattle ranching systems developed on stolen indigenous lands. What we eat, how we eat, the flavors we consider normal, all shaped by imperialism's global reach. Decolonizing diets means understanding these connections, questioning what seems natural, recognizing that food is political. Sports carry imperial legacies too. Cricket binds former British colonies in a commonwealth of competition. Football spread globally through British influence. The Olympics, supposedly apolitical, exclude nations that fall out of favor with Western powers while welcoming those who commit comparable atrocities but remain allies. Racial hierarchies persist. Black athletes face discrimination, indigenous athletes see their symbols appropriated, women athletes battle for equal recognition. Even in play, in games meant to transcend politics, imperialism's patterns reassert themselves. The concept of development itself deserves scrutiny. The idea that all nations should follow the same path, industrialize, urbanize, adopt Western economic systems and political structures, is imperialism's intellectual legacy. It assumes one correct way to organize society, coincidentally the way Western nations organized theirs. Alternative approaches are dismissed as backward, traditional societies treated as problems to be solved rather than different ways of being that might offer valuable insights. Development becomes a cudgel, used to justify intervention, to impose conditions on aid, to reshape societies according to Western blueprints. Yet some nations chart different paths. Bhutan measures gross national happiness rather than just economic output, prioritizing well-being over growth. Cuba achieved remarkable health and education outcomes despite decades of embargo, proving that development metrics can be achieved without capitalist models. Indigenous communities worldwide maintain sustainable relationships with their environments that industrialized nations are only beginning to appreciate. These alternatives suggest that the Western path isn't universal, that other ways forward exist if we're willing to learn from rather than dominate others. Climate justice movements connect imperialism's past to the planet's future. They argue that the wealthy nations most responsible for emissions should bear the primary burden of addressing climate change. This means not just reducing their own emissions but funding adaptation in vulnerable nations, accepting climate refugees, transferring clean technology without demanding profits. It means recognizing that the prosperity enjoyed by former imperial powers was built partly on environmental destruction that now threatens everyone, and that repair requires redistribution on a massive scale. Indigenous peoples lead many environmental movements, protecting forests and rivers not as resources but as relatives, as sacred entities with inherent value. Their cosmologies, dismissed by colonizers as primitive, offer frameworks for understanding human relationships with nature that industrial societies desperately need. The irony is profound. The peoples whose ways of life were nearly destroyed by imperialism now hold knowledge crucial for humanity's survival. Listening to them requires humility, requires acknowledging that Western modernity doesn't have all answers, that some wisdom was nearly lost and must be recovered. Reconciliation requires more than words. It requires land return, resource redistribution, political autonomy, cultural respect. It requires former imperial nations accepting lower standards of living so others can rise. It requires wealthy individuals acknowledging that their fortunes rest on historical exploitation and accepting taxation or voluntary redistribution. It requires structural changes that fundamentally alter global power dynamics. These are hard asks, requiring sacrifice from those who benefit from current arrangements. History suggests such changes rarely happen voluntarily, they're forced by movements, by pressure, by the oppressed refusing to accept injustice any longer. The movements are growing. From Chile to Lebanon, from Hong Kong to Nigeria, people challenge systems they see as unjust. The specific grievances vary, but underlying threads connect them: rejection of corruption, demand for dignity, resistance to being treated as disposable. These movements understand that formal independence hasn't delivered real freedom, that new forms of domination replaced old ones, that the struggle continues. They're writing new chapters in the long story of resistance to empire, adapting tactics, building solidarity across borders, imagining futures that break from oppressive pasts. Social media enables this organizing in ways previous generations couldn't imagine. A protest in one nation inspires tactics adopted halfway across the world. Information spreads instantly, making it harder for governments to hide atrocities. But the same technologies enable surveillance and control. Governments track activists, algorithms suppress dissent, disinformation campaigns divide movements. Technology is a tool, and like all tools, its effects depend on who wields it and toward what ends. The struggle over technology's future is part of the larger struggle over who shapes the world to come. Youth lead many of these movements, and their internationalism offers hope. Young people connect across borders, learn each other's languages, build friendships and alliances that transcend nationality. They're less invested in national myths, more willing to acknowledge imperial histories, more committed to building something different. They inherit a world shaped by imperialism but refuse to accept that those shapes are permanent. Their activism, their art, their refusal to be silent, these are seeds of transformation, though whether they'll flourish remains uncertain. The backlash against these movements is fierce. Authoritarian leaders rise by promising to restore past greatness, to reject globalization, to protect national identity. Their rhetoric echoes imperialism: strong nations deserve to dominate, outsiders threaten purity, strength matters more than justice. They appeal to people who feel left behind by globalization, whose economic security has eroded, who see their culture changing and fear what they're losing. The appeal is understandable even if the prescription is poison. People want dignity, security, belonging. When progressive movements don't provide that, reactionary ones fill the void. Breaking imperialism's legacy requires addressing those fears and needs, not dismissing them. It requires building economies that provide dignity without exploitation, communities that offer belonging without exclusion, identities that affirm without denigrating others. It requires acknowledging that imperialism harmed everyone, including many people in imperial nations, workers whose labor was devalued through colonial extraction, communities whose cultures were homogenized, individuals taught to define their worth through domination of others. Decolonization benefits everyone, even those who think they benefit from current arrangements. The work is both material and psychological. Materially, it requires redistribution of wealth and power on a global scale. Psychologically, it requires dismantling superiority complexes, healing trauma passed down through generations, learning to see differently. People in former imperial nations must recognize their privilege without drowning in guilt. People in formerly colonized nations must reclaim their dignity without replicating domination. Everyone must learn to see each other as fully human, equally deserving of flourishing, connected in mutual responsibility. Education is crucial but insufficient. Reading books about imperialism, diversifying curricula, exposing students to multiple perspectives, these help, but they don't automatically transform societies. Knowledge without action remains academic. The challenge is translating understanding into changed behavior, into political pressure, into new policies and practices. It's ensuring that learning about historical injustice leads to commitment to current justice, that knowledge of how we got here informs visions of where we should go. Art and culture can bridge where argument fails. Stories that humanize those dismissed as other, music that crosses boundaries, films that challenge comfortable assumptions, these reach people emotionally in ways that statistics and analysis cannot. They build empathy, spark imagination, make different futures feel possible. Every generation produces artists who challenge dominant narratives, who recover suppressed histories, who envision liberation. Supporting and amplifying those voices is part of decolonization's work. Religion plays complex roles. Missionary Christianity was imperialism's partner, justifying conquest and erasing indigenous spiritualities. Yet liberation theology emerged from Christianity too, priests standing with the poor against oppression, religious communities sheltering refugees, faith motivating sacrifice for justice. Islam was both colonized and colonizer, victim and perpetrator. Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, all contain resources for resistance and for domination. The question isn't which religion is inherently liberatory but how believers interpret their traditions, whether they use faith to justify hierarchy or to demand dignity for all. Ultimately, imperialism's legacy is a choice. Not about whether it happened, the historical record is clear. Not about whether it shaped the present, the evidence surrounds us. The choice is what we do with that knowledge. Do we accept injustice as inevitable, inequality as natural? Do we defend systems that benefit us while harming others? Or do we commit to transformation, to building a world less marked by domination, more characterized by mutual flourishing? The path won't be smooth. Vested interests will resist. Change threatens those who profit from current arrangements. Progress will be uneven, victories partial, setbacks inevitable. But history shows that change is possible. Slavery ended. Formal empires fell. Rights expanded. What seemed permanent and natural crumbled when enough people refused to accept it. The same can happen with imperialism's remaining structures if enough people commit to the work. That work begins with recognition. Recognizing that the world we inhabit was shaped by choices, by violence, by systems designed to concentrate power and wealth. Nothing about current arrangements is inevitable or natural. The poverty in some regions and prosperity in others, the languages that dominate and those that fade, the borders that divide and the institutions that rule, all of it was constructed by human hands and can be reconstructed differently. The first step toward change is rejecting the lie that things must be this way. Recognition leads to responsibility. Those who benefit from unjust systems bear responsibility for challenging them, even when they didn't create them. Inheritance isn't just about receiving assets, it includes inheriting debts and obligations. If your prosperity was built partly on exploitation, you carry responsibility for repair. This isn't about guilt, guilt often paralyzes rather than motivates. It's about acknowledging connection and acting from that awareness. We're linked across continents and generations, and those links create obligations we didn't choose but cannot ethically ignore. Reparative action takes many forms. Political activism demanding policy changes. Economic choices supporting ethical alternatives. Educational work spreading awareness. Professional commitments using skills for justice. Personal relationships building across divides. Creative expression imagining better futures. None sufficient alone, but together they create pressure for transformation. Change happens when enough people in enough places refuse to accept injustice, when individuals become movements, when movements shift culture, when culture transforms systems. The vision shouldn't be merely undoing imperialism but building something genuinely new. Not returning to pre-colonial pasts, those are gone, and romanticizing them helps no one. Not simply inverting hierarchies, replacing one domination with another. But creating structures that genuinely serve all people, that distribute resources equitably, that respect diverse ways of being, that treat the planet as home rather than resource. This requires imagination beyond what imperialism allows, willingness to experiment, acceptance that mistakes will happen but learning is possible. Indigenous frameworks offer guidance. Many emphasize relationality, understanding ourselves as embedded in webs of connection rather than isolated individuals. Many prioritize sustainability over growth, seeing humans as one part of ecosystems rather than masters of nature. Many practice consensus-based decision-making rather than hierarchical authority. These aren't perfect models to adopt wholesale, but they offer alternatives to the individualism and domination that characterize Western modernity. They remind us that other ways are possible because other ways existed and, despite attempts to destroy them, persist. Technology could serve liberation if directed differently. Communication tools connect activists globally. Renewable energy could democratize power rather than concentrating it. Medical advances could improve health universally if not trapped behind patents. Education could be accessible to all through digital platforms. But this requires intentional choices about technology's development and distribution, rejecting the assumption that efficiency and profit should be primary values. It requires asking not just what's possible but what's desirable, who benefits, what's lost, whether alternatives exist. Economic transformation is essential but insufficient alone. Redistributing wealth matters, but so does transforming the values that shape economic life. Moving beyond growth as primary measure of success. Recognizing care work, raising children, tending elders, maintaining communities, as valuable as market labor. Shortening work weeks so people have time for relationship and rest. Building economic democracy where workers share in governance and profits. These changes challenge fundamental assumptions about what economy is for, moving from maximizing production toward supporting flourishing. Political institutions need reimagining too. Representative democracy, a system developed in small European nations, struggles at global scale. How do we govern an interconnected world without replicating empire's patterns? How do we make decisions that affect everyone while respecting local autonomy? How do we prevent domination without creating gridlock? These questions lack clear answers, but experiments continue. Participatory budgeting in Brazilian cities, liquid democracy in digital platforms, nested councils in Rojava. Learning from these experiments, scaling what works, abandoning what fails, this is how new forms emerge. The environmental crisis makes transformation urgent. We no longer have centuries to gradually shift systems. Climate change, biodiversity collapse, resource depletion, these demand rapid, fundamental change. The same growth imperative that drove imperial expansion now threatens planetary survival. Breaking from that logic isn't optional anymore. The question is whether change happens through collapse or through conscious choice, through chaos or through planning, through violence or through cooperation. The hour is late, but possibility remains if we act decisively. Future generations will judge us not by our intentions but by our actions. They'll inherit the world we leave, its climate, its conflicts, its possibilities. They'll ask why we knew what imperialism had done yet allowed its structures to persist. They'll wonder whether we lacked courage, imagination, or solidarity. Or they'll see that we tried, that we challenged unjust systems, that we planted seeds even when we couldn't see the harvest. History's judgment comes slowly, but it comes. What we do now echoes forward in ways we can barely imagine. The story of imperialism is a story of human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. It reveals how easily we justify harming others when it serves our interests, how quickly we forget atrocities that don't affect us directly, how persistently we defend unjust systems that benefit us. But it also reveals courage, people who resisted despite overwhelming odds, who preserved their cultures despite attempts to erase them, who kept fighting for freedom across generations. It reveals creativity, the ways oppressed peoples adapted, survived, created beauty and meaning even in darkness. Both possibilities live within us still. The capacity to dominate and the capacity to resist domination. The willingness to exploit and the commitment to solidarity. The comfort of inherited privilege and the courage to challenge it. Every day we choose, often in small ways, which capacity to nurture. Do we buy products made by exploited labor because they're cheaper? Do we speak up when we hear racist assumptions or remain silent? Do we learn about injustices we benefit from or avoid that knowledge? Do we support politicians who promise easy answers or those who acknowledge complexity? These choices seem small individually, but collectively they shape the world. The children being born today will inherit what we leave them. They'll grow up in a world still marked by imperialism's legacy, borders, languages, inequalities, conflicts, all tracing back to conquest and extraction. But they'll also inherit resistance movements, alternative visions, examples of people who chose differently. They'll face choices about whether to maintain or transform inherited systems. What they choose will depend partly on what we teach them, what examples we provide, what worlds we help them imagine. Storytelling matters because stories shape how we see ourselves and each other. The stories we tell about imperialism, who was heroic, what was inevitable, which suffering matters, influence contemporary politics and ethics. If we tell stories where conquest was glorious, explorers were heroes, and empire brought progress, we justify contemporary domination. If we tell stories that center the colonized, that acknowledge violence and extraction, that complicate easy narratives, we enable different politics. Every history class, every museum exhibit, every monument in a public square tells a story and shapes imagination. The statues coming down across the world signal shifting stories. When protesters toppled Edward Colston's statue in Bristol and threw it in the harbor, they weren't erasing history, they were refusing to honor a man who made his fortune trafficking humans. When Confederate monuments fall in America, when statues of Leopold are removed from Belgian cities, when crowds in South Africa deface Cecil Rhodes's memorial, they're insisting that not all history deserves celebration. They're demanding space in public memory for those who were colonized, enslaved, exploited. They're reshaping the story. But removal alone isn't sufficient. Empty plinths don't teach anything. The question becomes what replaces removed monuments, memorials to resistance, to victims, to alternative visions. How do we mark historical atrocity without celebrating it, remember violence without glorifying it, acknowledge pain without exploitation? Germany's Stolperstein, small brass plaques in sidewalks marking where Holocaust victims lived, offer one model. They're stumbling blocks, literally and metaphorically, interrupting daily life with reminders of what happened here. Similar approaches could mark slavery, colonial massacres, indigenous displacement. Museums evolve too, slowly. More exhibits now acknowledge colonial violence, question artifact acquisition, include indigenous curators and perspectives. Some institutions return human remains held for anthropological study, ancestors who deserve burial, not display. Some rewrite labels, contextualizing objects within histories of theft and exploitation. These changes face resistance from those who preferred comfortable myths, but they continue because enough people demand truth over comfortable fiction. Truth commissions in some nations attempt formal reckoning. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission let apartheid's victims testify, let perpetrators confess, sought healing through acknowledgement. It was imperfect, many victims felt justice was sacrificed for peace, many perpetrators went unpunished. But it modeled public confrontation with historical atrocity, created official record of suffering, attempted to build shared truth as foundation for moving forward. Whether such approaches can work for imperialism's longer timescales and more diffuse responsibilities remains uncertain, but the attempt matters. Compensation debates continue without resolution. How much is owed, by whom, to whom? Should reparations be collective or individual? Financial or symbolic? One-time payments or sustained transfers? Should contemporary citizens of former imperial powers pay for ancestors' crimes? Should nations that didn't exist when empire flourished, unified Germany, modern Britain, carry historical obligations? These questions have no universally accepted answers, but avoiding them because they're difficult perpetuates the injustice that created them. Some argue we should move forward without dwelling on the past, that historical grievances prevent progress, that everyone suffered and focusing on particular suffering is divisive. This argument ignores how past injustices create present inequalities, how unacknowledged trauma festers, how moving forward requires understanding what we're moving from. You can't heal wounds you refuse to examine. You can't build justice on foundations of denial. Moving forward requires looking backward clearly, acknowledging what happened, accepting responsibility for its continuing effects. Others argue that imperialism's legacy is so pervasive that meaningful change is impossible, that systems are too entrenched, that powerful interests will never surrender advantage. This argument risks becoming self-fulfilling prophecy, justifying inaction through assumed futility. History shows that seemingly permanent systems do change when enough people refuse to accept them. Slavery seemed natural until it didn't. Colonial empires seemed eternal until they fell. What seems impossible becomes inevitable when consciousness shifts and movements organize. The truth lies between naive optimism and defeatist pessimism. Change is possible but not guaranteed. Systems can transform but won't transform themselves. Those who benefit from injustice won't voluntarily relinquish advantage, they must be pressured, persuaded, or overridden. Progress requires sustained effort across generations, accepting that we won't see all results of our actions, planting trees whose shade we'll never enjoy. It requires hope tempered by realism, determination despite setbacks, solidarity across differences. Imperialism shaped humanity by connecting the world in ways both generative and destructive. It spread technologies, ideas, genes, creating hybrid cultures and mixed populations. It destroyed and created, took and gave, though never equitably. We can't untangle those connections, too much has mixed, too much has changed. But we can redirect them toward justice rather than exploitation, toward mutual flourishing rather than domination. We can build on the connections imperialism created while rejecting the hierarchies it imposed. The work is both enormous and intimate. Enormous in requiring global transformation of economic, political, and cultural systems. Intimate in requiring each person to examine their assumptions, challenge their biases, change their behaviors. Both scales matter. Structural change without personal transformation leaves old attitudes in place, ready to recreate injustice in new forms. Personal growth without structural change leaves unjust systems intact, allowing individuals to feel virtuous while benefiting from exploitation. We need both, always, everywhere. In the end, imperialism's story is still being written. The chapters we've walked through tonight, from the first ancient conquests to the industrial empires, from the world wars to the independence movements, from the colonial past to the neocolonial present, these are not finished narratives. They're ongoing, living histories that continue to shape every aspect of our lives. The borders we respect, the languages we speak, the wealth we possess or lack, the opportunities we have or are denied, all bear imperialism's fingerprints. But here, as the night deepens and our journey together nears its end, there's something important to remember. History is not fate. The patterns that shape the past do not have to determine the future. Every generation inherits the world its ancestors made, but every generation also has the power to remake it. The chains of imperialism are real, but they are human creations, and what humans create, humans can transform. Tonight, we've traced how a handful of empires reached across oceans and centuries to reshape humanity itself. We've seen the brilliance and the brutality, the innovation and the destruction, the connections forged and the worlds lost. We've watched as conquest became system, as exploitation became economy, as domination became normalized. We've witnessed resistance in all its forms, armed rebellion and quiet refusal, cultural preservation and political organizing, the countless ways people insisted on their humanity even when others denied it. And we've arrived here, in the present moment, where imperialism's legacy surrounds us but doesn't imprison us. Where the work of decolonization continues in boardrooms and classrooms, in courtrooms and city streets, in the quiet choices we make about how to live and who to be. The empires fell, but their structures remain, waiting for us to decide whether to maintain them or dismantle them, whether to reproduce them or transform them. This is not a story with a neat ending, because the story isn't over. You are part of it. The choices you make, the values you uphold, the voices you amplify, the systems you challenge or support, these write the next chapters. History isn't something that happened to other people in distant times. It's happening now, always, in the cumulative weight of billions of individual decisions that become collective reality. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, carry this with you: the world was made by human hands, and human hands can remake it. The injustices we've traced through centuries were not inevitable, they were choices, and different choices remain possible. The patterns of domination that shaped the past don't have to define the future, not if enough people refuse to accept them, not if enough hands reach across the divides empire created to build something better. Imperialism shaped humanity, yes. But humanity can shape what comes next. In the space between what was and what might be, in the tension between inherited injustice and imagined justice, we find our work. Not to erase the past, that's impossible, but to transform how it lives in the present, to bend the arc that seemed so fixed towards something closer to justice, to honor those who resisted by continuing their work. The night is deep now. The story has been long, winding through centuries and across continents, touching millions of lives, most of them unnamed, many of them forgotten. But their struggles mattered. Their resistance mattered. Their survival mattered. And the choices we make now, in our moment, in our small corner of this vast human story, they matter too. Rest now. Let the weight of history settle gently, not as a burden that crushes but as knowledge that empowers. Let the stories of those who came before, who endured, who resisted, who dreamed of freedom even when it seemed impossible, let those stories strengthen you. Because the work continues. Tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as it takes. The empires are gone, but their ghosts remain. And it falls to us, to all of us, to decide whether those ghosts will haunt us forever or whether we'll finally lay them to rest. Sleep well. Dream of a world remade. And when you wake, remember, you're part of the story too. Your choices matter. Your voice matters. Your refusal to accept injustice matters. The future is not yet written, and every word we speak, every action we take, every connection we forge across the divisions empire created, these are the ink with which tomorrow's history will be composed. The story of imperialism taught us what humans are capable of, both the worst and the best. What we do with that knowledge, how we carry it forward, whether we repeat old patterns or break free to create new ones, that choice belongs to us. And that choice, made again and again by countless people in countless moments, will shape whether humanity's next chapter is written in the language of domination or in the vocabulary of justice, whether we continue empire's legacy or finally, decisively, choose something better. The night holds all of this, the past we've traced, the present we inhabit, the future we'll create. And as you slip into sleep, know that you've walked through history tonight, seen how the world was made, understood the systems that shape it still. Tomorrow, you wake with that knowledge. What you do with it, that's your story to write. Good night. Rest well. And may you dream of the world we might yet build together.